If you're a boxing fan, you've surely heard of John L. Sullivan, the Boston Strong Boy. He is historically recognized as the first world heavyweight champion in boxing. He was a superstar during his time and at his peak was considered by many to be unbeatable. There are some today who still consider Sullivan to be the greatest heavyweight ever. By that same token, some consider Sullivan nothing more than a backroom brawler. It's hard to say, but arguments could be made either way. One question that can be analyzed is whether or not Sullivan was the undisputed world heavyweight champion during his time. We're going to detail the four fighters that had Sullivan fought them and defeated them would have made his claim as heavyweight GOAT greater than ever. Before we dive in, here are a few notable honorable mentions who Sullivan could have faced had the timing been right. Bill Farnan. He was an Australian heavyweight champion and defeated and drew with Peter Jackson early in Jackson's career. Many considered Farnan a proper challenge for Sullivan's title. The Irish giant Peter Maher, one of the best heavyweights of the late 1890s who would have been a major threat had they fought based on Sullivan's commitment and conditioning. In the early part of 1892, Sullivan had agreed to fight Maher. The one stipulation was that Maher had to defeat Bob Fitzsimmons in a matchup they had scheduled for 1892. From there, Sullivan would need a year to train and would then take on Maher. Maher did fight and defeated Bob Fitzsimmons, but the Sullivan fight never materialized. Lastly, Bob Fitzsimmons, one of the most prolific punchers in boxing history. The Fighting Blacksmith and Sullivan were going to fight an exhibition in July of 1897 in Brooklyn, New York, but the police superintendent wouldn't allow the fight to take place. Sullivan was far from his previous condition and would have likely been embarrassed or knocked out by Fitzsimmons had the exhibition actually commenced and the two decided to get testy. And now we're going to dive into the four fighters that would have sent Sullivan's legacy soaring. Before we do that, please like, comment, and subscribe. Charles A.C. Smith, also known as C.C. Smith or C.A.C. Smith, was the first claimant of the colored world heavyweight title and thus recognized as the first to hold such distinction as early as 1876. Managed by Wild Bill Muldoon, a famous wrestler who would ironically go on to train Sullivan for his 1889 World Heavyweight title contest with Jake Kilrain. At around 5'11", 200 pounds, C.C. Smith matched well against Sullivan regarding the measurables. Furthermore, Sullivan and Smith came to prominence around the same time. Smith was considered a clever, powerful, and explosive fighter, earning him the nickname the Black Thunderbolt. Smith was estimated to have participated in over 200 fights during his career, both gloved and bare-knuckled. On February 7, 1882, John L. Sullivan defeated Paddy Ryan under London prize ring rules, essentially bare knuckles, to solidify his claim as the heavyweight champion of America and, depending on who you ask, the world. Fast forward to 1883, and C.C. Smith issued an open challenge to box John L. Sullivan in a 4-round gloved match or a bare-knuckle contest. Additionally, C.C. Smith had the backing of Richard Kyle Fox, owner of the National Police Gazette and arguably the most powerful man in boxing at the time. After covering the 1880 heavyweight contest between Paddy Ryan and Joe Goss, the Police Gazette became the unrivaled standard for boxing news and coverage. With Police Gazette's backing, it meant that you were considered the best fighter in the world in your weight class. It should also be mentioned that Fox and Sullivan were arch enemies who routinely took shots at each other through the better half of the late 1800s. Now, it could be argued that Fox had a vendetta against Sullivan and would have backed anyone against him, but Smith and Sullivan had practically an identical record at the start of 1883. Sullivan was 16-0 with 16 knockout victories, while C.C. Smith was 16-0-1 with 14 knockout victories. C.C. Smith traveled to Boston in early 1883 with the specific quest of facing John L. Sullivan. The fight never materialized, as it was also reported that Sullivan would not fight him because he was a man of color. Despite never facing Sullivan, C.C. Smith did share the ring with many other notable fighters of his era, including Professor Charles Hadley, who was the third man to ever win the colored world heavyweight title, defeating Morris Grant, who had took that title from C.C. Smith. C.C. Smith also laced up gloves against Old Chocolate George Godfrey, a former colored world heavyweight champion and someone we'll hear from again. He also faced the Harlem Coffee Cooler Frank Craig, a former colored world middleweight champion, Joe Butler, a former colored world middleweight champion. He faced the California Terror Joe Chewinski, a man who famously knocked out Jack Johnson, the Irish Giant Peter Marr, a claimant of the world heavyweight title, George Gardner, the second ever man to hold the world light heavyweight title, and the tough and rugged bare-knuckler turned boxer Jim Smith, former champion of England. C.C. Smith was a legitimate threat to John L. Sullivan. Old Chocolate George Godfrey is a name that should be known when thinking about the great black heavyweights of the past. He left enough of an impression that another fighter would take on his namesake and have success in the same division. Godfrey also is a man who seemingly holds the distinction of being the one black fighter that came as close as one could get to fighting John L. Sullivan without the fight actually happening. At 5'10" and a half and weighing a generous 174 pounds, George Godfrey wasn't a large heavyweight and would certainly fall into the ranks of light heavyweight by today's standard. Still, he made up for the lack of size by ensuring he was in top condition and employing pugilistic skill focused on the technical side of boxing. Hailing from the Bog in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, Canada, Godfrey came up rough, and one could argue it hardened him for his path ahead. Godfrey turned pro at 27, a late age for boxing, and especially heavyweights, but had no trouble picking up the sport. In September of 1881, it's been suggested that Sullivan and Godfrey were in the ring at a private club, stripped to their trousers as they were about to face off in a contest before the police intervened and prevented it from happening. Godfrey would go on to face common opponent Jake Kilrain 3 times, with the final fight taking place in 1891, which was a classic 44-round contest that lasted nearly 3 hours before Godfrey was stopped. Between 1882 and 1899, Godfrey would face the likes of C.C. Smith, the first colored world heavyweight champion, Professor Charles Hadley, another former colored world heavyweight champion and the man Godfrey defeated to become colored world heavyweight champion himself in 1883. He'd also take on the Black Prince Peter Jackson in an 1888 classic that saw Jackson stop Godfrey. Godfrey was giving up 30 pounds in weight, and Peter Jackson was the best heavyweight in the world at the time by many people's assumptions. In the January 4th, 1889 paper, it was reported by the president of the California Athletic Club that Sullivan had challenged Godfrey to stand against him at one of his charity events in Boston. Sullivan also noted that he would spar a black fighter named Bill Williams over 6 rounds in San Francisco, but the manager couldn't procure a license. Sullivan would also decline to fight Black Prince Peter Jackson, arguably the greatest heavyweight of the era, as he stated he would fight no colored man, nor would he fight any man who stepped foot in the ring with a colored man. San Francisco was the home of the California Athletic Club, and it was reported that San Franciscans viewed Sullivan's decision as an act of cowardice. Godfrey would go on to share the ring with the former colored world heavyweight champion Denver Ed Martin, knocking him out. He'd also faced California Terror Joe Chewinski, losing via TKO, and he would also face the likes of the Irish Giant Peter Marr at the tail end of his career as well. Sullivan was very much capable of stopping Godfrey had they fought, but the fact that they didn't leaves a ton of questions unanswered. Australia played a major role in heavyweight boxing during the late 1800s, producing some of the toughest and most rugged competitors in the sport's history. Frank Paddy Slavin was one of those guys. At about 6'1" and a half and weighing around 190 plus pounds, the Maitland, Australia native was as game as any fighter to come from down under. Like Sullivan, Slavin packed a big punch, knocking out 38 of his opponents in 43 victories. Sullivan often fought on the front foot with Cyberboxing Zone comparing him stylistically to Jack Dempsey. Be as it may, Sullivan did hold the Australian Heavyweight Championship and had a resume that would match or top just about any heavyweight during his era. Sullivan racked up several wins in Australia, where his first 46 fights took place between 1882 and 1889. Amid this run, he twice fought the fighting blacksmith Bob Fitzsimmons, a former world heavyweight, world light heavyweight, and world middleweight champion, for which he had a draw and won no contest in 2 4-rounders. Sullivan knocked out former Australian heavyweight champion Bill Farnan, the first man to defeat Black Prince Peter Jackson. Sullivan would also knock out former Australian heavyweight champion Harry Lang, becoming the only man to defeat him in his career. Sullivan would pick up the title by knocking out then Australian heavyweight champion Mike Dooley in 1888. After a brief tour of wins in the United Kingdom from 1889 to 1890, by 1891, Sullivan was on U.S. soil, home of John L. Sullivan. Back in December of 1889, Sullivan offered $5,000 to face Sullivan within 6 months and put up $500 in forfeit money to secure his agreement. In January of 1890, a syndicate of members of the Pelican Club from the UK, including the Marquess of Queensberry at the time, sent a cable stating they'd be willing to fund a bout between Sullivan and Sullivan in the United States. In 1891, Sullivan fought 2 common opponents of John L. Sullivan, Charlie Mitchell, the first man to drop Sullivan and force him into a draw. The other opponent was Jake Kilrain, who Sullivan defeated in the last bare-knuckle championship match to pick up the world heavyweight title in 1889. Sullivan twice drew with Mitchell in 3-round contests and knocked out Jake Kilrain in the 9th round of their Police Gazette title match. Additionally, in July of 1891, the Melbourne Athletic Club offered a purse of $20,000 for Sullivan and Sullivan to meet at their club, which was the equivalent of $667K in 2023. Sullivan accepted the offer. In December of 1891, Sullivan spoke freely to reporters in response to John L. Sullivan stating that Sullivan wasn't anxious to face him.
I am in this business for money. I am here prepared to fight, and I can finish training in 10 weeks. I am willing to allow Sullivan much more time, but it is simply unreasonable for him to say he does not think he can fight before October 1892.
Sullivan had stated that he did not desire a match until the latter part of October or November of 1892. Sullivan stated he'd be ready in 10 weeks, but would allow Sullivan extra time to train. Additionally, Sullivan had already agreed to a fight with the Black Prince Peter Jackson lined up for May of 1892 in London with the Commonwealth heavyweight title on the line. Even one of Sullivan's prominent backers, James Wakely, backed off further support for Sullivan as he viewed Sullivan as a man in need of reform and felt that the Sullivan fight would not happen because of such. By December of 1891, the Sullivan and Sullivan teams had met in principle and agreed that Sullivan would have a 15-week camp and would meet in September of 1892, so as long as Sullivan was able to defeat Peter Jackson. Richard Kyle Fox was willing to back Sullivan's forfeit money, while another promoter was willing to pay interest to Sullivan on the money put up for the fight until September. Still, the decision wasn't final unless Sullivan agreed to the stipulations. Sullivan's representatives stated that Sullivan had verbally stated that he was willing to agree to terms once he finished theoretical obligations and that they could only take him for his word. By January of 1892, Sullivan was seeking backers to fund the $2,300 forfeit money to face Sullivan after arrangements with Richard Kyle Fox fell through. Ultimately, the fight would never happen, as Sullivan's final fight turned out to be his loss to James J. Corbett in 1892. Sullivan would go on to fight Peter Jackson, being knocked out in the 10th round. Sullivan secured $10,000 in funding for a fight in 1894, but nothing materialized. Sullivan would be no stranger to other top-level competition either. This included Jim Hall, a former Australian middleweight champion with wins over Bob Fitzsimmons and Joe Chowinski. Sullivan knocked out the Harlem Coffee Cooler Frank Craig in their 1895 contest. Sullivan would lose to the king of the Battle Royal, Bob Armstrong, a former world-colored heavyweight champion, and the Irish giant Peter Marr. Sullivan would also share the ring with former colored world middleweight champion Joe Butler before calling it a career in 1903. Sullivan attempted a comeback in 1907, being knocked out by Nick Burley in his final fight. There's no question that the most significant threat to John L. Sullivan was the Black Prince Peter Jackson. Peter Jackson was born on July 3, 1861, in Christiansted, Danish West Indies. This is now the U.S. Virgin Islands. Eventually, Australia would become his home of record, and as Australian heavyweight champion, the country would back him against any man in the world, Sullivan included. Jackson was an adaptable fighter who could change his style for the opponent. He was also known as a scientific boxer with a high-level ring IQ and skill set to accompany his quickness and explosiveness. Additionally, many boxing proponents at the time viewed Jackson as the greatest boxer ever. Jackson learned his trade under the tutelage of Larry Foley, arguably Australia's greatest ever trainer. Then Australian heavyweight champion Peter Jackson stepped foot on United States soil in 1888, landing in San Francisco, California, with one thing in sight, the World Heavyweight Championship. This was, of course, held by John L. Sullivan. The color line was immediately drawn. After a quick tune-up in June, his first order of business was defeating Old Chocolate George Godfrey to pick up the colored World Heavyweight Championship. After nearly 5 months of newspaper pressure and the lure of a purse of $600, the mission boy Joe McCauley finally signed to fight Jackson despite refusing to fight a black man prior. McCauley had a win over notable Sullivan opponent Patty Ryan. For the Jackson contest, the purse was winner takes all, and the confident McAuliffe was knocked out in 24 rounds. Jackson also picked up the Pacific Coast heavyweight title with the win. Jackson came out of the contest with barely a scratch, while McAuliffe suffered a broken nose, amongst other injuries. The crowd was amazed at the speed and scientific skill of Jackson per reports. After the victory, Charlie Mitchell sent word that Jake Kilrain was willing to fight the winner of Jackson McAuliffe and had lined up a purse of between $200 and $500. Upon hearing this, Jackson accepted, and bets started being made on the scene that Kilrain would eventually back out. The fight did not happen. Despite such, Sullivan's New York backers sent word that while Jackson may challenge him, Sullivan wouldn't pay attention to it because he had long declared he would face no man of color or any man who had previously stepped foot in the ring with a man of color. Jackson would knock off common John L. opponent Patsy Cardiff in 10 rounds in 1889. He'd also knock out former Australian heavyweight champion Tom Lees in the same year. With Sullivan refusing to budge on his stance, Jackson continued to fight at a rapid pace, knocking off opponent after opponent in America, 12 in total through August of 1889. Frustrated with Sullivan's refusal to fight, Jackson traveled to the United Kingdom, where he would rack up another 12 straight victories through December 2nd of 1889. This included picking up the Commonwealth Boxing Council heavyweight title by defeating Jim Smith in November. On December 24th, Jackson would meet Irish giant Peter Marr in Dublin, Ireland, stopping Marr in 3 rounds. During his UK run on December 7th, reports were released including several pugilistic authorities in England who were asked to share their opinions of the John L. Sullivan versus Peter Jackson matchup. Bare-knuckle great Jim Mace shared the following.
I consider Jackson the wonder of the world. Smith was no match whatsoever for him. If Sullivan was in proper condition, I think he would be the best man in a fight to the finish. But he will hardly ever get into first-class fix again. He don't like the work, you know.
Harry Bull, a.k.a. Chippy Norton, a late Victorian-era boxing trainer, stated that, I backed Jackson for over $1,500 in the Smith affair, but I think John L. Sullivan can lick him, without a doubt. John Davies, an ex-British heavyweight, stated, Jackson is another John L., and the pair ought to make a splendid go in a fair field with no favors. Parson Davies, manager of Jackson, stated, Peter would knock Sullivan out in the first round. Jack Baldock, a man considered the Prince of the Seconds, stated, I would much prefer to be behind the white man if I had my chance. Jim Carney, then English lightweight champion and former world lightweight title challenger, declined to give an opinion as he had his sights set on Jack McCauley, the first ever world lightweight champion. Jack Harper, who was one of Jim Smith's seconds, stated Jackson is a good boxer, but I think Smith would defeat him in his old style. Sullivan would be my favorite against the colored man. A well-known owner of racehorses, George Alexander Byard, a.k.a. Squire Abington, lost many hundred pounds betting on Jim Smith and refused to give an opinion on the fighters. Jack Hyams, a lightweight contender and title challenger for the time, said he thought Jackson was a better man than Sullivan. The varying opinions surrounding the fight made it all that intriguing. In January of 1890, it was reported that Peter Jackson had accepted a challenge from Sullivan for $10,000 a side, with $20,000 being offered up by the California Athletic Club. On April 7, 1890, the president of the California Athletic Club received a telegram from Sullivan's team stating he had accepted the fight and would make arrangements after he settled matters in Mississippi on June 23rd of that year, which were legal issues stemming from his fight with Jake Kilrain. By August of 1890, Sullivan still hadn't signed an agreement for the Jackson fight. Jackson was reported to be disappointed in the matter and noted that he would soon head back to Australia and wanted to get the fight done before doing so. On August 8th, the Carnival Palace in Ogden, Utah offered a purse of $30,000 to a finish fight between Sullivan and Jackson, with the winner taking $25,000 and the loser getting $5,000. $30,000 is the equivalent of over $1 million in 2023. Interestingly enough, on May 30th, 1891, Peter Jackson and John L. Sullivan would have a run-in in Peter's Saloon in San Francisco, California. This was in the aftermath of Jackson having gone 61 rounds to a draw with eventual Sullivan rival, Gentleman James J. Corbett. The contest was long and drawn out, and there were varying views as to who should have been given the nod, though consensus seemed to be on the side of Jackson. The intent was for the winner to face John L. Sullivan for the World Heavyweight Championship. The draw, of course, complicated things. Back to the saloon, Sullivan was making it apparent that he disliked Peter Jackson. Sullivan was demonstrating how Corbett could have knocked Jackson out in front of his friends and saloon patrons. He was also stating that Jackson was no fighter. Little did Sullivan know Peter Jackson was actually in the back room of the saloon and heard what was being said. Jackson then came from the back pretending to not know who Sullivan was and tapped him on the shoulder while stating, "Look here, young man, you don't know what you're talking about. You're talking out the side of your hat." Sullivan replied, "Who are you talking to? I don't stand such language from your kind of people." Jackson replied, "Well, I'm talking to you, and I request that you're talking through your hat." The fight was seemingly about to go down right then and there, but friends of Sullivan stepped between the two men and tried to separate them. Jackson would not have it as he shoved the peacemakers to the side while again stating, "You're talking through your hat." Jackson then opened his vest and was at the point of pulling off both his vest and coat when friends of Sullivan again crowded the men as Sullivan's friends convinced him to leave the saloon, something he willingly accepted. Jackson was stated to have been in great shape, and it was viewed that he would have whipped Sullivan had the two fought right then and there. On November 10th, 1891, Jackson challenged Frank Slavin to a contest as Slavin had been making claims that he was the Australian heavyweight champion, though Jackson never relinquished such. This was also coupled with the fact that the still proposed Sullivan bout was going to take place within a year, the amount of time Sullivan said it would take for him to get in condition for the contest. In February of 1892, while at a stop in Denver, Colorado, Sullivan reported that he would fight Jackson provided he defeats Frank Slavin. Many sporting news pundits still didn't think the fight would happen given Sullivan's previous statements regarding facing men of color. Jackson knocked out Frank Slavin in 20 rounds on May 30th, 1892. As history has shown, John L. Sullivan would go on to fight James J. Corbett on September 7th, 1892, being knocked out and relieved of his title in the 21st round of a finish fight. There too went Jackson's chance at the World Heavyweight title. Jim Corbett had stated that he would eventually fight Jackson with the title on the line, but nothing ever materialized. Some reporters felt Corbett was the luckiest man alive, having won the heavyweight title, while there were also those who considered him a coward and thought that he was a man who ducked tough competition. That said, in the end, the John L. Sullivan versus Peter Jackson clash eluded us all in what would have been the biggest fight of the era given the demand. Jackson would go on to face then up-and-coming future world heavyweight champion James J. Jeffries in 1898. Jackson at this point was past his prime and likely suffering from the early stages of tuberculosis, as he would die from the disease a year later. In a 1909 interview, Sullivan had the following to say with regards to facing Peter Jackson.
The manager of Jackson once claimed to have a telegram from me telling him to go ahead with the details of a fight with Jackson. There were never any such articles drawn or even suggested that I would have signed. The nearest I came to fighting Jackson was once when the question was put up to me squarely. I said that if they got $20,000, I would cover it, and would go into a room with Jackson and have it out, but that I would never agree to meet him in the ring in public. That ended the attempts to get me to fight Jackson.
There you have it. Boxing legacies aren't made overnight, and John L. Sullivan is without a doubt a legend in the sport of boxing. That being said, there were fights that should have taken place, and much like any era, the fans during the time were deprived of those great fights. In the case of John L. Sullivan, his name still rings bells across the sports, especially the heavyweight division, but one must question what would have turned out had he fought the men that were mentioned in this video. Additionally, there may have been others who would have been worthy challengers in or around the time as well. Let us know what you think in the comments.